The invitation was gold-pressed, heavy, the kind of luxury my ex-husband Jake always said I was too common to touch. But this wasn't a threat from a syndicate or a legal notice. It was a wedding invitation. Jake, the most feared mafia boss in the underworld, was marrying a rival's daughter, and he wanted me there to witness his new, perfect life. The note inside was in his arrogant, sharp handwriting. No hard feelings, Jane. Every boss needs a queen who can actually handle his throne. Hope you can find a babysitter for the boy. No hard feelings. No hard feelings about throwing me and our infant son out into a storm with nothing but the clothes on our backs. I stared at that gold card in my cramped apartment while David slept, and then I saw the date. June 15th. Our wedding anniversary. He was replacing me on the one day that was supposed to be ours. Hey, besties. Welcome back. If this story is already hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments. Have you ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow? Also, drop your time and location so we can say hi. Now, let's get back to the most expensive revenge. That was the moment I stopped hiding. I was going to that wedding, but not as the weak link he discarded. I was going as the woman who now held his entire empire's debt in my designer handbag. My name is Jane, and this is the story of how I arrived at a mafia wedding in a billionaire's private jet to take back everything he stole, starting with his dignity. Stay with me because he never saw this coming. The gold-leafed card sat on my chipped kitchen counter like a predatory animal. The apartment was too quiet. David was at school, and my coffee had long since turned to ice. I hadn't moved. The invitation seemed to mock me, glowing with the wealth I was never supposed to have again. I picked it up, then dropped it. Picked it up again. My phone sat nearby, one click away from calling the man who had helped me build an empire in the shadows while Jake thought I was scrubbing floors. I looked at the formal script. Jake Han and Min-hee Choi request the honor of your presence. My hands shook. The heavy cardstock felt like lead. There was a handwritten note inside. His script. The same handwriting that used to leave me love notes before he became the Iron Boss. Jane, I know this might be awkward, but I hope you'll come. The boy should see what his father is building. No hard feelings. Best, Jake. No hard feelings. I read it 3 times. Each time the words felt more like a slap. No hard feelings about the nights I spent wondering how I'd buy David's milk. No hard feelings about being erased because I wasn't born into the syndicate. I checked the date again. June 15th. My breath hitched. June 15th, our anniversary. The day we stood in a small chapel, and he swore he'd burn the world down before he let me go. The invitation slipped from my fingers, landing face up on the floor. A memory hit me. 5 years ago, almost to the day, Jake had come home early. I was in the kitchen. David was just a few months old, laughing in his high chair. Jake didn't look at us. He just handed me a suitcase and told me his new life didn't have room for distractions. The rain did not just fall. It screamed. It slammed against the cracked pavement of the driveway, turning the dirt into a thick, black soup. Jane stood in the middle of it, her clothes soaking through until they felt like lead against her skin. Behind her, the front door of the small house hung open, spilling a square of warm, yellow light onto the wet porch. It was the only warmth left in her world, and it was about to disappear. Jake stood in the doorway. He didn't look sad. He didn't even look angry. He looked bored. In his hand, he held Jane's old canvas suitcase. With a quick jerk of his arm, he tossed it onto the muddy grass. The lock snapped open on impact, and her few belongings, thin sweaters and old books, began to drink in the rain. "You don't belong here, Jane," Jake said. His voice was calm, which made his words hurt even more. "Look at you. You're shaking because of a little water. You're too soft for this life." Jane tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was full of sand. "I tried, Jake. I did everything you asked." "Trying isn't enough," he replied, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at her like she was a math problem he couldn't be bothered to solve. "In this business, if you aren't a wolf, you're dinner. You've got a heart made of marshmallows, and it's going to get us both killed. Go back to the city. Find a nice, safe job. Forget you ever knew me." "Jake, please," she whispered. "Goodbye, Jane." He stepped back and pulled the door shut. The click of the lock was louder than the thunder rolling overhead. Jane sank to her knees in the mud. The cold was starting to numb her fingers and toes, but the fire in her chest was growing. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. She hated them for it. She hated the tears that mixed with the rain on her face. She hated that he was right, at least for now.
She was soft. She was easy to break.
She reached out and grabbed a handful of the cold, wet earth. She squeezed it until her knuckles turned white and the grit got under her fingernails. The physical pain was a relief. It was something she could control. "Never again," she said into the dark. Her voice was thin, but it didn't shake this time. She thought about carbon. She had read once in school that coal and diamonds were made of the same stuff. The only difference was how much heat and pressure they could take. Jake thought he had crushed her, but he had really just started the clock. If the world wanted to press down on her, she would let it. She would let the weight of this night, the cold of the she walked until her legs burned and her lungs felt like they were on fire. She welcomed the ache. It was proof that she was still moving. The night of ash, she would later call it, because everything she used to be had burned away, leaving only the hard, gray truth behind. She was alone. She was cold, and for the first time in her life, she was truly dangerous. She was going to become harder than diamonds, and diamonds, she knew, were very good at cutting things apart. Rain, and the sting of his words pushed her together until there was no softness left. She stood up slowly, leaving the suitcase behind. She didn't need those old clothes or those old memories anymore. They were part of the girl who cried in the rain. That girl was staying here in the mud. As Jane walked away from the house, she didn't look back. Every step felt heavier, but her mind was getting clearer. She would find a way to survive. She would learn how to speak without fear and how to act without hesitation. She would build a shell so thick that nothing could ever get through it again. Jake wanted a wolf. She would become something much worse. She would become a blade. She would become a mountain. By the time she saw him again, she wouldn't be the girl who couldn't handle the rain. She would be the storm. The walk from that muddy driveway had lasted long after the rain stopped. 5 years had passed, but Jane still felt the chill of that night in her bones. Now, she stood in a room that was the exact opposite of Jake's porch. It was high above the city, filled with walls of glass and floors so polished they looked like still water. A man sat behind a desk made of dark, heavy wood. This was Marcus Thorne. People called him a tech billionaire, but to Jane, he looked like a person who knew every secret in the world and found them all a bit funny. He didn't look scary. He looked sharp. "Sit down, Jane," Marcus said, not looking up from a thin tablet. "You've been working for my security team for 6 months. You are the best they have, but you are wasting your time." Jane sat, her back straight. She didn't fidget. The girl who shook in the rain was gone. "I do my job well," she replied. "You do," Marcus agreed, finally looking at her. His eyes were like cold blue flint. "But you want more. I can see it in how you move. You are looking for a weapon to use against the man who threw you away. You think you need to learn how to fight better or shoot straighter. You're wrong." Jane felt a spark of anger, but she kept her face still. "Jake is dangerous. He has power in the streets." Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Jake is a caveman. He thinks power is a heavy hand and a loud voice. That is old power. It is slow and messy." He leaned forward, tapping his temple with one finger. "Real power is knowing where your enemy sleeps, what they fear, and who they owe money to before they even know it themselves." He pushed a small glass drive across the desk toward her. "Information is the only weapon that never misses, Jane. A bullet can be blocked. A fist can be dodged. But the truth? Once you have the right piece of information, you can end a man's life without ever being in the same room as him." Jane looked at the drive. It was small and light, almost nothing. "I can teach you how to see the world through the wires," Marcus continued. "I can show you how to find the cracks in any wall. If you want to be hard like a diamond, that's fine. But a diamond is just a rock unless you know where to strike it to make it shatter. I will teach you where to strike." Jane reached out and took the drive. The metal was cool against her palm. She thought of Jake's face when he closed the door on her. He thought he had left her with nothing. He didn't realize that by taking everything away, he had made room for something much more dangerous to grow. "Why help me?" Jane asked. "Because the world is full of people like Jake who think they are in control," Marcus said, leaning back into his chair. "I find it very boring. I want to see what happens when someone like you, someone with nothing left to lose, finally learns how to pull the strings." Jane stood up. She didn't need a gun or a knife. She felt the weight of the information she was about to learn. Marcus was right. Jake was playing a game with sticks and stones, while she was about to learn how to command the lightning. "When do we start?" she asked. Marcus smiled, and for the first time, Jane didn't feel like the victim of the story. She felt like the author. "We already have," he said. The training Marcus gave her had turned Jane into a ghost in the machine, but life had a way of bringing her back to Earth. That Earth was now a quiet, sun-filled kitchen where her son, David, sat at the table. He was 8 years old, with eyes that looked exactly like the man who had thrown Jane out into the rain all those years ago. David was pushing a piece of toast around his plate. He wasn't eating. He looked up at Jane, and his face was serious in a way that made her heart skip a beat. "Mom," he asked softly, "was my dad a good man?" The question hit Jane harder than any physical blow. She had spent 5 years building a wall around David. She moved them to a safe house, gave him the best teachers, and kept the curtains closed to the dark world she now moved in. She wanted him to be soft, but not the kind of soft that got you hurt. She wanted him to be happy. Jane sat down across from him. She didn't want to lie, but she wasn't ready for the truth to break him. "Your father was a man who made choices, David. Some were hard, and some were wrong. He lived a life that didn't have room for people like us." "Is that why we move so much?" David asked. "Because of his choices?" Jane looked at her son's small hands. They were steady. He wasn't shaking like she had been on that night of ash. She realized in that moment that her plan was failing. She was trying to keep him in a bubble, but bubbles were thin. They popped the moment things got rough. If she kept him hidden, he would grow up to be a foot soldier, someone who followed orders and got hurt by the whims of men like Jake. She reached across the table and took his hand. "We move because I am making sure no one can ever tell you where to go or what to do. David, listen to me. There are 2 kinds of people in this world. There are the people who wait for permission, and there are the people who own the room." "Which one is Dad?" "He thinks he owns the room," Jane said, her voice turning as hard as the diamond she had promised to become. "But he only owns the floor. I am going to make sure you own the whole building." She saw a spark of curiosity in David's eyes. He didn't fully understand yet, but the seed was planted. Jane knew what she had to do now. She couldn't just protect him. She had to build a throne for him. She had to use the information Marcus taught her to create a kingdom that David would one day rule. He would never have to beg for a place to stay. He would never have to stand in the rain while someone else decided his worth. "Finish your breakfast," Jane said, her tone shifting back to the gentle mother he knew. "After your lessons, I'm going to show you how to read a map of the city. Not just the streets, but the ways people move through them. It's time you started learning how the world really works." As David started to eat, Jane looked out the window. She wasn't just a mother anymore, and she wasn't just a student of Marcus Thorne. She was the architect of a future Jake could never touch. She would give David a throne so high that he would never even have to look down at the people trying to climb up. The ghost heir was finally waking up, and Jane would make sure he was ready to lead. Jane sat in a room that was as white and clean as a fresh sheet of paper. She wore a suit of the same color, sharp and without a single wrinkle. On the monitors in front of her, rows of numbers moved like tiny ants. To anyone else, they were just boring bank records. To Jane, they were the map of Jake's downfall. For years, Jake had run his businesses through the shadows. He thought he was smart because he used fronts, fake shops, and hidden companies to move his money. But every business, even a dirty one, has to owe someone something. They owe for electricity, for the rent on their warehouses, and for the loans they took to start their crimes. Jane didn't need to fight his men in the alleys. She just needed to buy his bills. Her fingers danced across the keyboard. With a few clicks, she authorized her company to buy the debt of a trucking firm Jake used to move stolen goods. 10 minutes later, she bought the mortgage on the club where he spent his Friday nights. She wasn't stealing his money. She was becoming his landlord. She was becoming the person he had to pay just to keep his lights on. Word began to spread through the city's underworld. The name Jane was never used. Instead, the tough men who worked for the Mafia started whispering about the woman in white. They talked about a ghost who lived in the clouds and could freeze a bank account with a single thought. They feared her more than the police because the police had to follow rules. This woman simply took away their ability to eat. Jane watched a live video feed of one of Jake's warehouses. A man in a cheap leather jacket was trying to swipe a credit card to pay for gas for his delivery truck. The machine flashed red. Denied. The man shook the machine, confused and angry. Jane watched him from her white chair, her face as still as stone. Denied, she whispered to the empty room. She remembered the feeling of her suitcase hitting the mud. She remembered the sound of the lock clicking. Back then, Jake had all the power because he had a roof and she had none. Now, the roles were shifting. Jake was still using his fists, but Jane was using the air he breathed. Every time she bought a piece of his debt, she felt a little more of that old coldness leave her body. She wasn't just getting even. She was performing an audit of his entire life, and she was finding that he was worth nothing at all. By the end of the day, Jane owned the debt of 5 of Jake's main businesses. He didn't know it was her yet. He only knew that his world was starting to glitch. The woman in white was closing in, and she wouldn't stop until every cent Jake thought he owned belonged to the girl he had left in the rain. Jane leaned back and looked at her white sleeve. Not a speck of mud in sight. The room was filled with tall mirrors that made the space look like it went on forever. In the center stood a tailor, an older man with silver hair and a measuring tape draped over his neck like a snake. He moved quietly around Jane, pinning fabric and tucking edges. On a nearby chair lay a pile of colorful dresses, but Jane didn't even look at them. She had no interest in silk or lace. The white one, Jane said, her voice steady. The tailor held up the jacket. It was a power suit, crisp and bright. It was the color of a blank page or a flash of lightning. When Jane slipped it on, she felt the heavy pads in the shoulders settle into place. It made her look taller and wider. She didn't look like a bride waiting for a wedding. She looked like a general preparing for a war. She looked at her reflection. 5 years ago, she had been covered in black mud and gray rain. Now, she was wrapped in a white so pure, it almost hurt to look at. She wasn't just a woman anymore. With David growing up and her empire expanding, she had become the queen mother of this new world she had built. She was the one who provided, the one who protected, and the one who made the rules. It fits perfectly, madam, the tailor whispered. Good, Jane replied. She turned to the door. Bring them in. The door opened, and 3 men walked into the room. They didn't move like normal people. They moved like predators, quiet, smooth, and always watching the corners of the room. These were her new bodyguards. They weren't just guys from the neighborhood with big muscles. They were former elite special forces. They had fought in deserts and jungles, and they knew how to spot a threat before it even started to move. The leader of the group, a man with a scarred jaw named Miller, stepped forward. He looked at Jane in her white suit. He didn't see a soft woman. He saw a boss who had the money to buy the best and the brains to use them. We've checked the building, ma'am, Miller said. The exits are clear. The digital sweep is done. No one gets near you, or the boy unless you say so. Jane nodded. She felt a deep sense of peace. For so long, she had been the one looking over her shoulder, wondering if Jake or his friends would find her. Now, she had a wall of steel around her. She had the information Marcus gave her, the money she took from Jake's debts, and the best soldiers money could buy. She walked over to the window and looked down at the city. Somewhere down there, Jake was probably still sitting in his dark club, wondering why his world was falling apart. He had called her soft. He had told her she was too weak for his life. He was right about one thing. She was too good for his life. She had built a better one, and she had dressed it in white. Miller, Jane said, not turning around. Yes, ma'am. We move tomorrow. It's time I saw Jake face to face. The room was silent, save for the faint snip of the tailor's scissors. Jane smoothed the front of her white jacket. The armor was on. The guards were ready. The Queen Mother was stepping out of the shadows, and the city was about to find out exactly what happened when you tried to break a diamond. The air above the coastal estate was usually quiet, filled only with the sound of waves hitting the rocks and the soft music of a violin. Below, the garden was a sea of expensive silk and polished shoes. Jake's sister was standing under a flowered arch, her white dress trailing in the grass. The wedding march began to play, a light and happy tune that was supposed to mark the start of a perfect day. Jake stood in the front row, his chest puffed out, looking like he owned the very sky above him. Then, the sky began to growl. At first, it was just a low hum that vibrated in the wine glasses on the tables. But within seconds, the hum turned into a bone-shaking roar. The violin player stopped mid-note, the sound of the music swallowed by the screaming of jet engines. The guests didn't look at the bride anymore. They all looked up, shielding their eyes against the bright sun. A sleek, white private jet dropped out of the clouds. It was descending fast, much lower than any plane should be. The shadow of the aircraft swept across the garden like a giant hand, turning the bright party into a cold, dark space for a heartbeat. The wind from the engines whipped the tablecloths and sent flower petals flying through the air like snow. Jake squinted, his face twisting in confusion and anger. This was his family's big day. He had paid for the security to keep people out. He had paid for the privacy of this cliffside mansion. Yet, here was a machine worth millions of dollars, screaming over his head as if he didn't exist. The jet circled once, its engines whining as it slowed down toward the private landing strip at the edge of the property. The guests whispered to one another, their voices full of worry. Who had this kind of power? Who would dare to interrupt a wedding with such a loud and expensive entrance? The plane touched down on the black asphalt with a puff of blue smoke. It taxied toward the edge of the grass where the party was held. As the engines finally began to die down, the silence that followed was even louder than the noise. No one moved. The bride stood frozen, her veil tangled in a nearby rosebush. The door of the jet hissed open. A metal stairway folded down, clicking firmly into place. The guests leaned forward, craning their necks to see who would step out. They expected a billionaire, or perhaps a government official. Instead, they saw a flash of white. Jane stepped onto the platform. Her white power suit glowed under the sun, looking even brighter than the bride's dress. She didn't look like a guest, and she certainly didn't look like an intruder. She looked like the owner of the world. Behind her, the 3 Special Forces guards appeared, their dark sunglasses and steady gazes making it clear that the party was over. Jane looked down at the crowd, her eyes searching until they found Jake. He looked small from up there. He looked like the man who had once thrown a suitcase into the mud, but now he was the one standing in the dirt while she looked down from the clouds. She didn't smile.
She didn't wave.
She simply waited for the world to realize that the woman in white had arrived, and she had brought the storm with her. Jane moved down the stairs of the jet with a slow, steady rhythm. Every step was a message. She didn't look at her feet. She kept her chin up, looking straight ahead at the crowd of people who used to scare her. The sun caught the gold buttons on her white jacket, making her look like a creature made of light. This was the billionaire aesthetic. She didn't need to shout to be heard, and she didn't need to run to be fast. She simply existed, and the world moved out of her way. At the bottom of the stairs, Jake's personal security team rushed forward. These were the men Jane remembered from the old days. They were big men with thick necks and hidden guns, the kind of men who used their size to make people feel small. They reached for their belts, ready to block her path, and demand to know who she was. But as Jane got closer, they stopped. It wasn't just the 3 elite guards walking behind her that made the men freeze. It was Jane herself. They looked at her expensive suit, the way the private jet hummed behind her, and the calm look in her eyes. She didn't look like a trespasser. She looked like the person who owned the ground they were standing on. They were used to dealing with angry rivals or common thieves, but they had no idea what to do with a woman who looked like she could buy their entire lives with a single phone call. One guard started to raise his hand to stop her, but his arm stayed halfway in the air. Jane didn't even slow down. She walked right past him, her shoulder nearly brushing his. She didn't look at him, and she didn't ask for permission. She treated him like he was a piece of furniture, something to be walked around and then forgotten. The guard stood there, stunned and silent, his mouth hanging open as she passed. The guests parted like a wave. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that was filled with the smell of expensive perfume and jet fuel. Jane walked across the green grass, her white heels never sinking into the soft earth. She felt like she was floating. She saw the faces of people she used to know. They were the people who had laughed when Jake called her soft. Now, they were pulling their children back and staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. They didn't recognize the girl from the rain, but they recognized power when they saw it. Jane kept her eyes locked on the front row. There, standing by the flowered arch, was Jake. He wasn't bored anymore. His face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking at his sides. He looked like he was seeing a ghost, and in a way, he was. He was seeing the ghost of the woman he had tried to destroy, now reborn in a fire of white silk and cold, hard cash. She reached the edge of the seating area and stopped. She was only 10 feet away from him now. The elite guards behind her spread out, creating a wall of shadow that blocked out the rest of the party. Jane took a deep breath, enjoying the clean, salt air of the coast. The soft girl was gone. The woman in white had finally come home to collect what was hers, and not a single guard in the world was brave enough to stand in her way. Jake stood as still as a statue. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He wasn't looking at Jane's white suit or the massive jet behind her anymore. His eyes were locked on the young boy who stepped out from behind the wall of bodyguards. David walked with his head held high, his dark hair messy in the wind, and his jaw set in a way that mirrored Jake's exactly. The resemblance was so strong that a collective gasp went up from the guests. It was like looking at a ghost of Jake's own childhood. The business merger wedding, which was supposed to join two powerful crime families together, suddenly felt very cold. The bride's father, a man with a mean face and a lot of gold rings, stepped forward. He looked at Jake, then at the boy, then back at Jake. The silence was heavy and thick. Everyone knew what this meant. This wasn't just a party anymore. It was a scandal that would ruin the trust between the two families. "Jake," the bride whispered, her voice trembling. "Who is that child?" Jake didn't answer her. He couldn't. He looked at Jane, and for the first time in 5 years, he looked afraid. He remembered the rain. He remembered the girl who had begged him for a second chance. He looked for that girl now, but all he found was the woman in white, a person who looked like she could crush him without even trying. Jane walked closer until she was standing right in front of him. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a simple white envelope. It looked like a regular wedding card, but it felt much heavier. She held it out, her hand perfectly steady. "I heard you were celebrating a new beginning, Jake," Jane said. Her voice was smooth and clear, carrying across the silent garden. "It's only fair that I help you close the door on your old life." Jake took the envelope with shaking fingers. He ripped it open, hoping for a check or maybe a letter. Instead, his eyes fell on a legal document stamped with red ink. It was a foreclosure notice. It stated that the main building he used as his headquarters, the heart of his entire operation, now belonged to a company he had never heard of. It was a company owned by Jane. "You can't do this," Jake hissed, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "That's my home. That's my business." "It was your business," Jane corrected him gently. "But you stopped paying the bills, Jake. You were so busy being a wolf that you forgot to check the fence. I bought your debt. I own your chairs, your desks, and the roof over your head. You have 24 hours to clear out." The bride's father let out a growl of anger. "You brought a bankrupt man into my family," he shouted at Jake. The alliance was breaking apart right there in the grass. The bodyguards for the other family began to move away from Jake, leaving him standing alone. Jane looked down at David and smiled. She didn't need to say anything else. She had given her son a throne by taking away the ground Jake stood on. She turned around, her white cape swirling in the breeze, and began to walk back toward the jet. She had delivered her gift, and the fire she had started was already burning everything Jake loved to ash. The silence that followed Jane's words was sharper than a knife. The bride, a woman who had spent months planning this perfect day, looked down at the red stamped paper in Jake's hand. She looked at the anger on her father's face and the fear in Jake's eyes. She wasn't just looking at a man who had lied about a son. She was looking at a man who was suddenly poor. In her world, being poor was a sin that could never be forgiven. She didn't scream or cry. She simply reached up and unhooked the long, lacy veil from her hair. She let it fall to the grass, where the wind tumbled it into the dirt. Without saying a single word to Jake, she turned her back on him. She walked toward her father, and together, they signaled for their own guards to leave. The wedding march was dead. The business merger was over. Jake tried to reach out for her. "Wait," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I can fix this. It's just one building." But Jane leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The pressure of the climb pushed her into the seat, but it felt good. It was the kind of pressure that turned coal into diamonds. She had taken everything Jake valued, his money, his pride, and his future, and she had done it without firing a single shot. She had used the information Marcus gave her to build a throne, and as the jet leveled out above the clouds, Jane finally felt warm. The night of ash was over. The era of the Queen Mother had begun. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt small or worthless or forgotten, I want you to know something. You're not alone, and you're stronger than you think. If you enjoyed this journey with me, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. People who need to hear them, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a moment where you'd stood up for yourself? Where you finally said enough? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your stories. And if you want more stories about survival, strength, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I share new stories every week.